2. Take 2 and 2, 1. This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the 2 towers. A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way! Oh my God, there it goes!
Get ready to read all these words on this page without making a mistake. Look at the letter at the end and remember the sound it makes. Get ready.
Kite.
Yes, kite. Get ready to read this word the fast way. Get ready.
Kid.
Yes, kid. Sound it out. Get ready.
Kid.
Sound it out. Get ready.
Kid.
What word?
Kid.
Yes, kid. Boys and girls, sound this word out. Get ready.
Seal.
What word?
Seal.
Yes, steel. Read these words the fast way. Get ready.
Playing.
Yes, playing. Get ready.
Must.
Yes, must. Let's read these words the fast way without making a mistake. Get ready.
Kite.
Yes, kite. Get ready.
Kit.
Yes, kit. Get ready.
Seal.
Yes, steel. Get ready.
Playing.
Yes, playing. Get ready.
Must.
What's this other jet doing? What's
What
this
the
other
hell
jet
is
doing?
that?
Holy fuck!
Oh my God! Oh my God! Jesus fucking Christ! Get ready.
Kid.
Yes, sound it out. Get ready.
Kid.
Sound it out. Get ready.
Kid.
What word?
Kid.
Yes, kid. Boys and girls, sound this word. Get ready.
Man.
Yes, man. Get ready.
Cat.
Yeah.
Okay, get ready to read the words on this page without making a mistake.
When the second plane hit the tower, his chief of staff entered the classroom and told Mr. Bush, the nation is under attack.
Count of 3, everyone.
Not knowing what to do, with no one telling him what to do,
Yes,
and no Secret Service rushing in to take him to safety, Mr. Bush just sat there and continued to read My Pet Goat with the children. Nearly 7 minutes passed with nobody doing anything.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
More than a decade later, the U.S. is still fighting in Afghanistan.
For year after year after year, with 120, 150,000 troops on the ground.
I have determined that it is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan so that they can target the insurgency and secure key population centers.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
Thousands of people have been killed from barrel bombings in Syria. Here, a lucky escape from a 2-month-old baby following a barrel bomb attack in Aleppo in July.
Still, the American death toll in Afghanistan is less than half that from the war in Iraq. The U.S. military effort there ended in December 2011.
In Iraq, you had a much larger force go in a much more violent way initially than you had in Afghanistan. Then that large force stayed.
This is tape 1 of 3 tapes on the New Order of Barbarians, referred to on these tapes as simply the New World System. Tapes 1 and 2 are reminiscence by Dr. Lawrence Dunnigan of a speech given on March 20th, 1969 by an insider of the Order, whose names and credentials are given in the interview with Dr. Dunnigan on tape 3. The moderator for these tapes is Randy Engel, National Director, U.S. Coalition for Life.
There has been much written and much said by some people who have looked at all the changes that have occurred in American society in the past 20 years or so, and who have looked then retrospectively to earlier history of the United States and indeed of the world, and come to the conclusion that there is a conspiracy of sorts which influences, indeed controls, major historical events not only in the United States but around the world. This conspiratorial interpretation of history is based on people making observations from the outside, gathering evidence, and coming to the conclusion that from the outside they see a conspiracy. Their evidence and conclusion are based on evidence gathered in retrospect, period. I want to now describe what I heard from a speaker in 1969, which in several weeks will now be 20 years ago. The speaker did not speak in terms of retrospect, but rather predicting changes that would be brought about in the future. The speaker was not looking from the outside in, thinking that he saw conspiracy. Rather, he was on the inside, admitting that indeed there was an organized power, force, group of men who wielded enough influence to determine major events involving countries around the world, and he predicted, or rather expounded on changes that were planned for the remainder of this century. As you listen, if you can recall the situation, at least in the United States in 1969 and the few years thereafter, and then recall the kinds of changes which have occurred between then and now, almost 20 years later, I believe you'll be impressed with the degree to which the things that were planned to be brought about have already been accomplished. Some of the things that were discussed were not intended to be accomplished yet by 1988, but are intended to be accomplished before the end of this century. There is a timetable, and it was during this session that some of the elements of the timetable were brought out. Anyone who recalls early in the days of the Kennedy presidency, the Kennedy campaign, when he spoke of progress in the decade of the 60s, that was kind of a cliche in those days, the decade of the 60s. Well, by 1969, our speaker was talking about the decade of the 70s, the decade of the 80s, in the decade of the 90s. So that I think that terminology, that way of looking at things and expressing things, probably all comes from the same source. Prior to that time, I don't remember anybody saying the decade of the 40s and the decade of the 50s. So I think this overall plan and timetable had taken important shape with more predictability to those who control it sometime in the late 50s. That's speculation on my part. In any event, the speaker said that his purpose was to tell us about changes which would be brought about in the next 30 years or so that an entirely new worldwide system would be in operation before the turn of the century. As he put it, we plan to enter the 21st century with a running start. He said as we listened to what he was about to present, he said, some of you will think I'm talking about communism. Well, what I'm talking about is much bigger than communism. At that time, he indicated there is much more cooperation between East and West than most people realize. In his introductory remarks, he commented that he was free to speak at this time. He would not have been able to say what he was about to say even a few years earlier, but he was free to speak at this time because now, and I'm quoting here, everything is in place and nobody can stop us now. That's the end of that quotation. He went on to say that most people don't understand how governments operate, and even people in high positions in governments, including our own, don't really understand how and where decisions are made. He went on to say that the people who really influence decisions are names that, for the most part, would be familiar to most of us, but he would not use individuals' names or names of any specific organizations. But that if he did, most of the people would be names that were recognized by most of his audience. He went on to say that they were not primarily people in public office, but people of prominence who were primarily known in their private occupations or private positions. The speaker was a doctor of medicine, a former professor at a large Eastern university, and he was addressing a group of doctors of medicine, about 80 in number. His name would not be widely recognized by anybody likely to hear this, and so there's no point in giving his name. The only purpose in recording this is that it may give a perspective to those who hear it regarding the changes which have already been accomplished in the past 20 years or so, and a bit of a preview to what at least some people are planning for the remainder of this century, so that we or they would enter the 21st century with a flying start. Some of us may not enter that century. His purpose in telling our group about these changes that were to be brought about was to make it easier for us to adapt to these changes. Indeed, as he quite accurately said, they would be changes that would be very surprising and in some ways difficult for people to accept, and he hoped that we, as sort of his friends, would make the adaptation more easily if we knew somewhat beforehand what to expect. Somewhere in the introductory remarks, he insisted that nobody have a tape recorder and that nobody take notes, which for a professor was a very remarkable kind of thing to expect from an audience. Something in his remarks suggested that there could be negative repercussions against him if it became widely known what he was about to say to to our group if it became widely known that indeed he had spilled the beans, so to speak. When I first heard that, I thought maybe that was sort of an ego trip, somebody enhancing his own importance. But as the revelations unfolded, I began to understand why he might have had some concern about not having it widely known what was said, although this was a fairly public forum where he was speaking. Remarks were delivered, but nonetheless he asked that no notes be taken, no tape recorder be used, suggesting there might be some personal danger to himself if these revelations were widely publicized. Again, as the remarks began to unfold and some of the rather outrageous things that were said at that time, they certainly seemed outrageous, I made it a point to try to remember as much of what he said as I could, and during the subsequent weeks and months and years to connect my recollections to simple events around me, both to aid my memory for the future in case I wanted to do what I'm doing now, record this, and also to try to maintain a perspective on what would be developing if indeed it followed the predicted pattern, which it has. At this point, so that I don't forget to include it later, I'll just include some statements that were made from time to time throughout the presentation, just having a general bearing on the whole presentation. One of the statements was having to do with change. People get used, the statement was, people will have to get used to the idea of change. So used to change that they'll be expecting change. Nothing will be permanent. This often came out in the context of a society of where people seem to have no roots or moorings, but would be passively willing to accept change simply because that was all they had ever known. This was sort of in contrast to generations of people up until this time, where certain things you expect to be and remain in place as reference points for your life. So change was to be brought about, change was to be anticipated and expected and accepted, no questions asked. Another comment that was made from time to time during the presentation was, people are too trusting. People don't ask the right questions. Sometimes being too trusting was equated with being too dumb. But sometimes when he would say that and say people don't ask the right questions, it was almost with a sense of regret, as if he were uneasy with what he was a part of and wished that people would challenge it and maybe not be so trusting. Another comment that was repeated from time to time, this particularly in relation to changing laws and customs and specific changes. He said everything has two purposes. One is the ostensible purpose, which will make it acceptable to people. And second is the real purpose, which would further the goals of establishing the new system and having it. Frequently he would say, there's no other way. There's just no other way. This seemed to come as sort of an apology, particularly when at the conclusion of describing some particularly offensive changes, for example, the promotion of drug addiction, which we'll get into shortly. He was very active with population control groups, the population control movement, and population control was really the entry point into specifics following the introduction. He said the population is growing too fast. Numbers of people living at any one time on the planet must be limited, or we will run out of space to live. We will outgrow our food supply, and we will overpollute the world with our waste. people won't be allowed to have babies just because they want to or because they are careless. Most families would be limited to 2. Some people would be allowed only 1, and the outstanding person or persons might be selected and allowed to have 3. But most people would allow to have only 2 babies. That's because the zero population growth is 2.1 children per completed family, so something like every 10th family might be allowed the privilege of the 3rd baby. To me, up to this point, the word population control primarily connoted limiting the number of babies to be born, but this remark about what people would be allowed and then what followed made it quite clear that when you hear population control, that means more than just controlling births. It means control of every endeavor of the entire world population. A much broader meaning to that term than I had ever attached to it before hearing this. As you listen and reflect back on some of the things you hear, you will begin to recognize how one aspect dovetails with other aspects in terms of controlling human endeavors. Well, from population control, a natural next step then was sex. He said sex must be separated from reproduction. Sex is too pleasurable and the urges are too strong to expect people to give it up. Chemicals in food and in the water supply to reduce the sex drive are not practical. The strategy then would be not to diminish sex activity, but to increase sex activity, but in such a way that people won't be having babies. And the first consideration then here was contraception. Contraception would be very strongly encouraged, and it would be connected so closely in people's minds with sex that they would automatically think contraception when they were thinking or preparing for sex. And contraceptives would be made universally available. Nobody wanting contraception would be find that they were unavailable. Contraceptives would be displayed much more prominently in drugstores and right up with the cigarettes and the chewing gum out in the open rather than hidden under the counter where people would have to ask for them and maybe be embarrassed. This kind of openness was a way of suggesting that contraceptives are just as much a part of life as any other item sold in the store. And contraceptives would be advertised. And contraceptives would be dispensed in the schools in association with sex education. The sex education was to get kids interested early, making the connection between sex and the need for contraception early in their lives, even before they became very active. At this point, I was recalling some of my teachers, particularly in high school, and found it totally unbelievable to think of them agreeing to, much less participating in distributing contraceptives to students. But that only reflected my lack of understanding of how these people operate. That was before the school-based clinic programs got started. Many cities in the United States by this time have already set up school-based clinics, which are primarily contraception, birth control, population control clinics. The idea then is that the connection between sex and contraception introduced and reinforced in school would carry over into marriage. Indeed, if young people, when they matured, decided to get married, marriage itself would be diminished in importance. He indicated some recognition that most people probably would want to be married, but that this certainly would not be any longer considered to be necessary for sexual activity. No surprise then that the next item was abortion, and this now back in 1969, 4 years before Roe v. Wade. He said abortion will no longer be a crime. abortion would be accepted as normal and would be paid for by taxes for people who could not pay for their own abortions. Contraceptives would be made available by tax money so that nobody would have to do without contraceptives. If school sex programs would lead to more pregnancies in children, that was really seen as no problem. Parents who think they are opposed to abortion on moral or religious grounds will change their minds when it is their own child who is pregnant. So this will help overcome opposition to abortion. Before long, only a few diehards will still refuse to see abortion as acceptable, and they won't matter anymore. Homosexuality also was to be encouraged. People will be given permission to be homosexuals. That's the way it was stated. They won't have to hide it. And elderly people will be encouraged to continue to have active sex lives into their very old ages as long as they can. Everyone will be given permission to have sex to enjoy however they want. Anything goes. This is the way it was put. And I remember thinking how arrogant for this individual or whoever he represents to feel that they can give or withhold permission for people to do things. But that was the terminology that was used. In this regard, clothing was mentioned. Clothing styles would be made more stimulating and provocative. Recall back in 1969 was the time of the miniskirt, when those miniskirts were very, very high and very revealing. He said it's not just the amount of skin that is exposed that makes clothing sexually seductive, but other more subtle things are often more suggestive. Things like movement and the cut of clothing and the kind of fabric, the positioning of accessories on the clothing. If a woman has an attractive body, why should she not show it, was one of the statements. There's was not detail on what was meant by provocative clothing, but since that time, if you watch the changes in clothing styles, blue jeans are cut in a way that they're much more tight-fitting through the crotch. They form wrinkles. Wrinkles essentially are arrows, lines which direct one's vision to certain anatomic areas. And this was around the time of the burn your bra activity. He indicated that a lot of women should not go without a bra. They need a bra to be attractive. So instead of banning bras and burning them, bras would come back, but they would be thinner and softer, allowing more natural movement. It was not specifically stated, but certainly a very thin bra is much more revealing of the nipple and what else is underneath than the heavier bras that were in style up to that time. Technology. Earlier he said sex and reproduction would be separated. You would have sex without reproduction, and then technology was reproduction without sex. This would be done in the laboratory. Indicated already much research was underway about making babies in the laboratory. There was some elaboration on that, but I don't remember the details, how much of that technology has come to my attention since that time. I don't remember in a way that I can distinguish what was said from what I subsequently have just learned as general medical information. Families would be limited in size. We already alluded to not being allowed more than 2 children. Divorce would be made easier and more prevalent. Most people who marry will marry more than once. More people will not marry. Unmarried people would stay in hotels and even live together. That would be very common. Nobody would even ask questions about it. It would be widely accepted as no different from married people being together. More women will work outside the home. More men will be transferred to other cities in their jobs. More men would travel into work. Therefore, it would be harder for families to stay together. This would tend to make the married relationship less stable, and therefore tend to make people less willing to have babies. And the extended family would be smaller and more remote. Travel would be easier, less expensive for a while, so that people who did have to travel would feel that they could get back to their families, not that they were abruptly being made remote from their families. But one of the net effects of easier divorce laws, combined with the promotion of travel and transferring families from one city to another, was to create instability in the families. If both husband and wife are working and one partner gets transferred, the other one may not be easily transferred. So one either gives up his or her job and stays behind while the other leaves, or else gives up the job and risks not finding employment in the new location. Rather diabolical approach to this whole thing. Euthanasia. Everybody has a right to live only so long. The old are no longer useful. They become a burden. You should be ready to accept death. Most people are. An arbitrary age limit could be established. After all, you have a right to only so many steak dinners, so many orgasms, and so many good pleasures in life. And after you've had enough of them, and you're no longer productive in working and contributing, then you should be ready to step aside for the next generation. Some things that would help people realize that they had lived long enough. He mentioned several of these. I don't remember them all. Here are a few. The use of very pale printing ink on forms that people necessary to fill out, so that older people wouldn't be able to read the pale ink as easily and would need to go to younger people for help. Automobile traffic patterns. There would be more high-speed traffic lanes, traffic patterns that older people would, with their slower reflexes, would have trouble dealing with, and thus tend to lose some of their independence. Big item which was elaborated at some length was the cost of medical care would be made burdensomely high. Medical care would be connected very closely with one's work, but also would be made very, very high in cost, so that it would simply be unavailable to people beyond a certain time. And unless they had a remarkably rich supporting family, they would just have to do it without care. And the idea was that if everybody sees enough what a burden it is on the young to try to maintain the old people, then the young would become agreeable to helping mom and dad along the way, provided that this was done humanely and with dignity. And then the example was there could be like a nice farewell party, a real celebration. Mom and dad had done a good job. And then after the party's over, take the demise pill. The next topic is medicine. There would be profound changes in the practice of medicine. Overall, medicine would be much more tightly controlled. The observation was made, Congress is not going to go along with national health insurance that in 1969 he said is now abundantly evident, but it's not necessary. We have other ways to control health care. These will come about more gradually, but all health care delivery would come under tight control. Medical care would be closely connected to work. If you don't work or can't work, you won't have access to medical care. The days of hospitals giving away free care would gradually wind down until that was virtually non-existent. Costs would be forced up so that people won't be able to afford to go without insurance. People pay. You pay for it, you're entitled to it. It was only subsequently that I began to realize the extent to which you would not be paying for it. Your medical care would be paid for by others, and therefore you would gratefully accept on bended knee what was offered to you as a privilege. Your role being responsible for your own care would be diminished. As an aside here, this is not something that was developed at that time. I didn't understand at the time. But as an aside, the way this works, everybody's made dependent on insurance. And if you don't have insurance and you pay directly, the cost of your care is enormous. The insurance company, however, paying for your care does not pay that same amount. If you are charged, say, $600 for the use of an operating room, the insurance company does not pay $600 on your part. They pay $300 or $400. And that differential in billing has the desired effect. It enables the insurance company to pay for that which you could never pay for. They get a discount that's unavailable to you. When you see your bill, you're grateful that the insurance company can do that, and in this way you are dependent and virtually required to have insurance. The whole billing is fraudulent. Anyhow, continuing on now, access to hospitals would be tightly controlled. Identification will be needed to get into the building. Security in and around hospitals would be established and gradually increased so that nobody without identification could get in or move around inside the building. Theft of hospital equipment, things like typewriters and microscopes and so forth, would be allowed, and exaggerated, reports of it would be exaggerated, so that this would be the excuse needed to establish the need for strict security until people got used to it. And anybody moving about in a hospital would be required to wear an identification badge with a photograph and telling why he was there, employee or lab technician or visitor or whatever. And this is to be brought in gradually, getting everybody used to the idea of identifying themselves until it was just accepted. This need for ID to move about would start in small ways, hospitals, some businesses, but gradually expand to include everybody in all places. It was observed that hospitals can be used to confine people for the treatment of criminals. This did not mean necessarily medical treatment. At that time, I did not know the word psycho prison, as in the Soviet Union, but without trying to recall all the details, basically he was describing the use of hospitals both for treating the sick and for confinement of criminals for reasons other than the medical well-being of the criminal. Definition of criminal was not given. The image of the doctor would change. No longer would he be seen as an individual professional in service to individual patients, but the doctor would be gradually recognized as a highly skilled technician, and his job would change. The job is to include things like executions by lethal injection. The image of the doctor as being a powerful, independent person would have to be changed. And he went on to say, doctors that make entirely too much money, they should advertise like any other product. Lawyers would be advertising too. Keep in mind, this was an audience of doctors being addressed by a doctor, and it was interesting that he would make some rather insulting statements to his audience without fear of antagonizing us. The solo practitioner would become a thing of the past. A few diehards might try to hold out, but most doctors would be employed by an institution of one kind or another. Group practice would be encouraged, corporations would be encouraged, and then once the corporate image of medical care, as this gradually became more and more acceptable, doctors would more and more become employees rather than independent contractors. And along with that, of course, unstated but necessary, is the employee serves his employer, not his patient. So that's, and we've already seen quite a lot of that in the last 20 years, and apparently more on the horizon. The term HMO was not used at that time, but as you look at HMOs, you see this is the way that medical care is being taken over since the national health insurance approach did not get through the Congress. A few die-hard doctors may try to make a go of it remaining in solo practice, remaining independent, which parenthetically is me. But they would suffer great loss of income. They'd be able to scrape by maybe, but never really live comfortably as those who were willing to become employees of the system. Ultimately, there would be no room at all for the solo practitioner after the system is entrenched. Next heading to talk about is health and disease. He said there would be new diseases to appear, which had not ever been seen before, would be very difficult to diagnose and be untreatable, at least for a long time. No elaboration was made on this, but I remember not long after hearing this presentation, when I had a puzzling diagnosis to make, I would be wondering, is this what he was talking about? Is this a case of what he was talking about? Some years later, as AIDS ultimately developed, I think AIDS was at least one example of what he was talking about. I now think that AIDS probably is a manufactured disease. Cancer. He said we can cure almost every cancer right now. Information is on file in the Rockefeller Institute if it's ever decided that it should be released. But consider, if people stop dying of cancer, how rapidly we would become overpopulated. You may as well die of cancer as something else. Efforts at cancer treatment would be geared more toward comfort than toward cure. There was some statement that ultimately the cancer cures which were being hidden in the Rockefeller Institute would come to light because independent researchers might bring them out despite these efforts to suppress them. But at least for the time being, letting people die of cancer was a good thing to do because it would slow down the problem of overpopulation. Another very interesting thing was heart attacks. He said, there is now a way to simulate a real heart attack. It can be used as a means of assassination. Only a very skilled pathologist who knew exactly what to look for at an autopsy could distinguish this from the real thing. I thought that was a very surprising and shocking thing to hear from this particular man at that particular time. This and the business of the cancer cure really still stand out sharply in my memory because they were so shocking and at that time seemed to me out of character. He then went on to talk about nutrition and exercise, sort of in the same framework. People would have to eat right and exercise right to live as long as before. Most won't. This in the connection of nutrition, there was no specific statement that I can recall as to particular nutrients that would be either inadequate or in excess. In retrospect, I tend to think he meant high salt diets and high fat diets would predispose toward high blood pressure and premature arteriosclerotic heart disease, and that if people were too dumb or too lazy to exercise as they should, then their circulating fats would go up and predispose to disease. And he said something about diet information about proper diet would be widely available, but most people, particularly stupid people who had no right to continue living anyway, they would ignore the advice and just go on and eat what was convenient and tasted good. There were some other unpleasant things said about food. I just can't recall what they were, but I do remember of having reflections about wanting to plant a garden in the backyard to get around whatever these contaminated foods would be. I regret I don't remember the details, the rest of this about nutrition and hazardous nutrition. With regard to exercise, he went on to say that more people would be exercising more, especially running, because everybody can run. You don't need any special equipment or place. You can run wherever you are. as he put it, people will be running all over the place. And in this vein, he pointed out how supply produces demand, and this was in reference to athletic clothing and equipment, as this would be made more widely available and glamorized, particularly as regards running shoes. This would stimulate people to develop an interest in running, and as part of a whole sort of public propaganda campaign, people would be encouraged then to buy the attractive sports equipment and to get into exercise. Again, well, in connection with nutrition, he also mentioned that public eating places would rapidly increase, that this had a connection with the family too. As more and more people ate out, eating at home would become less important. People would be less dependent on their kitchens at home. And then this also connected to convenience foods being made widely available. Things like you could pop into the microwave. Whole meals would be available prefixed. And of course we've now seen this in some pretty good ones. But this whole different approach to eating out and to previously prepared meals being eaten in the home was predicted at the time to be brought about convenience foods. And the convenience foods, though, would be part of the hazard. Anybody who was lazy enough to want the convenience foods rather than fixing his own also better be energetic enough to exercise, because if he was too lazy to exercise and too lazy to fix his own food, then he didn't deserve to live very long. This was all presented as sort of a moral judgment about people and what they should do with their energies. People who are smart, who would learn about nutrition, and who are disciplined enough to eat right and exercise right are better people and are the kind you want to live longer. Somewhere along in here there was also something about accelerating the onset of puberty, and this was said in connection with health, and later in connection with education, and connected to accelerating the process of evolutionary change. There was a statement that we think we can push evolution faster and in the direction we want it to go. I remember this only as a general statement. I don't recall if any details were given beyond that. Another area of discussion was religion. This is an avowed atheist speaking. And he said, religion is not necessarily bad. A lot of people seem to need religion with its mysteries and rituals, so they will have religion. But the major religions of today have to be changed because they are not compatible with the changes to come. The old religions will have to go, especially Christianity. Once the Roman Catholic Church is brought down, the rest of Christianity will follow easily. Then a new religion can be accepted for use all over the world. It will incorporate something from all of the old ones to make it more easy for people to accept it and feel at home in it. Most people won't be too concerned with religion. They will realize that they don't need it. In order to do this, the Bible will be changed. It will be rewritten to fit the new religion. Gradually, key words will be replaced with new words having various shades of meaning. Then the meaning attached to the new word can be close to the old word, and as time goes on, other shades of meaning of that word can be emphasized, and then gradually that word replaced with another word. I don't know if I'm making that clear, but the idea is that everything in Scripture need not be rewritten, just key words replaced by other words, and the variability in meaning attached to any word can be used as a tool to change the entire meaning of Scripture and therefore make it acceptable to this new religion. Most people won't know the difference, and this is another one of the times where he said the few who do notice the difference won't be enough to matter. Then followed one of the most surprising statements of the whole presentation. he said, some of you probably think the churches won't stand for this. And he went on to say, the churches will help us. There was no elaboration on this. It was unclear just what he had in mind when he said the churches will help us. In retrospect, I think some of us now can understand what he might have meant at that time. I recall then only of thinking, no, they won't, and remembering our Lord's words where he said to Peter, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So, yes, some people in the churches might help, and in the subsequent 20 years we've seen how some people in churches have helped. But we also know that our Lord's words will stand, and the gates of hell will not prevail. Another area of discussion was education, and one of the things in connection with education that I remember connecting with what he said about religion was, in addition to changing the Bible, he said that classics in literature would be changed. I seem to recall Mark Twain's writings was given as one example. But he said the casual reader reading a revised version of a classic would never even suspect there was any change, and somebody would have to go through word by word to even recognize that any change was made in these classics. The changes would be so subtle, but the changes would be such as to promote the acceptability of the new system. As regards education, he indicated that kids would spend more time in schools, but in many schools they wouldn't learn anything. They'll learn some things, but not as much as formerly. Better schools in better areas with better people, their kids will learn more. In the better schools, learning would be accelerated. And this was another time where he said, we think we can push evolution. By pushing kids to learn more, he seemed to be suggesting that their brains would evolve and that their offspring then would evolve, sort of pushing evolution in where kids would learn and be more intelligent at a younger age, as if this pushing would alter their physiology. Overall, schooling would be prolonged. This meant prolonged throughout the school year. I'm not sure what he said about a long school day. I do remember he said that school was planned to go all summer, that the summer school vacation would become a thing of the past, not only for schools but for other reasons. People would begin to think of vacation times year-round, not just in the summer. For most people, it would take longer to complete their education. To get what originally had been in a bachelor's program would now require advanced degrees and more schooling. So that a lot of school time would be just wasted time. Good schools would become more competitive. I inferred when he said that he was including all schools, elementary up through college, but I don't recall whether he said that. Students would have to decide at a younger age what they would want to study and get onto their track early if they would qualify. It would be harder to change to another field of study once you got started. Studies would be concentrated in much greater depth, but narrowed. You wouldn't have access to material in other fields outside your own area of study without approval. This seemed to be more where he talked about limited access to other fields. I seem to recall that as being more at the college level, high school and college level perhaps. People would be very specialized in their own area of expertise, but they won't be able to get a broad education and won't be able to understand what is going on overall. He was already talking about computers in education, and at that time he said anybody who wanted computer access or access to books that were not directly related to their field of study would have to have a very good reason for so doing. Otherwise, access would be denied. Another angle was that the schools would become more important in people's overall life. Kids, in addition to their academics, would have to get into school activities unless they wanted to feel completely out of it. But spontaneous activities among kids, the thing that came to my mind when I heard this was sandlot football and sandlot baseball teams that we worked up as kids growing up. I said to kids wanting any activities outside of school would be almost forced to get them through the school. There would be few opportunities outside. Now, the pressures of the accelerated academic program and accelerated demands where kids would feel they had to be part of something, one or another athletic club or some school activity. These pressures he recognized would cause some students to burn out. He said the smartest ones will learn how to cope with the pressures and to survive. There will be some help available to students in handling stress, but the unfit won't be able to make it. They will then move on to other things. In this connection, and later on in the connection with drug abuse and alcohol abuse, indicated that psychiatric services to help would be increased dramatically. In all the pushing for achievement, it was recognized that many people would need help, and the people worth keeping around would be able to accept and benefit from that help and still be super achievers. Those who could not would fall by the wayside and therefore were sort of dispensable, expendable, I guess is the word I want. Education would be lifelong. Adults would be going to school. There will always be new information that adults must have to keep up. When you can't keep up anymore, you're too old. This was another way of letting older people know that the time had come for them to move on and take the demise pill. If you got too tired to keep up with your education, you got too old to learn new information, then this was a signal you begin to prepare to get ready to step aside. In addition to revising the classics, which I alluded to a while ago with revising the Bible, he said some books would just disappear from libraries. This was in the vein that some books contain information or contain ideas that should not be kept around, and therefore those books would disappear. I don't remember exactly if he said how this was to be accomplished, but I seem to recall carrying away the idea that this would include thefts, that certain people would be designated to go to certain libraries and pick up certain books and just get rid of them. Not necessarily as a matter of policy, just simply steal it. Further down the line, not everybody will be allowed to own books, and some books nobody will be allowed to own. Another area of discussion was laws that would be changed. At that time, a lot of states had blue laws about Sunday sales and certain Sunday activities. They said the blue laws would all be repealed. Gambling laws would be repealed or relaxed so that gambling would be increased. Indicated then that governments would get into gambling. We've had a lot of state lotteries pop up around the country since then, and at the time we were already being told that would be the case. Why should all that gambling money be kept in private hands when the state could benefit from it, was the rationale behind it. But people should be able to gamble if they want to, so it would become a civil activity rather than a private or illegal activity. Bankruptcy laws would be changed. I don't remember the details, but just that they would be, and I know subsequent to that time they have been. Antitrust laws would be changed or be interpreted differently, or both. In connection with the changing antitrust laws, there was some statement that, in a sense, competition would be increased. But this would be increased competition within otherwise controlled circumstances. So it's not a free competition. I recall having the impression that it was like competition, but within members of a club. There would be nobody outside the club who would be able to compete. Sort of like teams competing within a professional sports league. If you're in the NFL or the American or National Baseball leagues, You compete within the league, but the league is all in agreement on what the rules of competition are. Not a really free competition. Drug use would be increased, alcohol abuse would be increased, and law enforcement efforts against drugs would be increased. On first hearing that, it sounded like a contradiction. Why increase drug abuse and simultaneously increase law enforcement against drug abuse? But the idea is that in part the increased availability of drugs would provide a sort of law of the jungle whereby the weak and the unfit would be selected out. There was a statement made at that time, before the earth was overpopulated, there was a law of the jungle where only the fittest survived. You had to be able to protect yourself against the elements and wild animals and disease, and if you were fit, you survived. But now that we've become so civilized, we're over-civilized, and the unfit are unable to survive only at the expense of those who are more fit. And the abuse of drugs then would restore, in a certain sense, the law of the jungle and selection of the fittest for survival. News about drug abuse and law enforcement efforts would tend to keep drugs in the public consciousness and would also tend to reduce this unwarranted American complacency that the world is a safe place and a nice place. The same thing would happen with alcohol. Alcohol abuse would be both promoted and demoted at the same time. The vulnerable and the weak would respond to the promotions and therefore use and abuse more alcohol. Drunk driving would become more of a problem, and stricter rules about driving under the influence would be established so that more and more people would lose their privilege to drive. This also had connection with something we'll get to later about overall restrictions on travel. Not everybody should be free to travel the way they do now in the United States. People don't have a need to travel that way. It's a privilege, was kind of the high-handed way it was put. Again, much more in the way of psychological services would be made available to help those who got hooked on drugs and alcohol. The idea being that in order to promote this drug and alcohol abuse, to screen out some of the unfit, people who otherwise are pretty good also would be subject to getting hooked. And if they were really worth their salt, they would have enough sense to seek psychological counseling and to benefit from it. So this was presented as sort of a redeeming value on the part of the planners. It was as if he were saying, you think we're bad in promoting these evil things, but look how nice we are. We're also providing a way out. More jails would be needed. Hospitals could serve as jails. Some new hospital construction would be designed so as to make them adaptable to jail-like use. Nothing is permanent. Streets would be rerouted, renamed. Areas you had not seen in a while then would become unfamiliar. Among other things, this would contribute to older people feeling that it was time to move on. People would feel they couldn't even keep up now with the changes in areas that were once familiar. Vacant buildings would be left to stand empty and to deteriorate, and streets would be allowed to deteriorate in certain localities. The purpose of this was to provide the jungle, the depressed atmosphere for the unfit. Somewhere in this same connection he mentioned buildings and bridges would be made so that they would collapse after a while. There would be more accidents involving airplanes and railroads and automobiles. All of this to contribute to the feeling of insecurity, that nothing was safe. Not too long after this presentation, and I think one or two even before, in the area where I live, we had some newly constructed bridge to break, another newly constructed bridge defect discovered before it broke, and I remember of reading just scattered incidents around the country where shopping malls would fall in right where they were filled with shoppers. And I remember that one of the shopping malls in our area, first building I'd ever been in where you could feel this vibration throughout the entire building when there were a lot of people in there. And I remember wondering at that time whether this shopping mall was one of the buildings he was talking about. Talking to construction people and architects about it, they'd say, "Oh no, that's good. Buildings vibrate like that. That means it's flexible and not rigid." Well, maybe so. We'll wait and see. Other areas, though, would be well maintained. Not every part of the city would be slummed. There would be the created slums and other areas well maintained. Those people able to leave the slum for better areas then would learn to better appreciate the importance of human accomplishment. This meant that if they left the jungle and came to civilization, so to speak, they could be proud of their own accomplishments, that they made it. There was no related sympathy for those who were left behind in the jungle of drugs and deteriorating neighborhoods. And then a statement that was kind of surprising: we think we can effectively limit crime to the slum areas so it won't be spread heavily into better areas. I should maybe point out here, these are not obviously not word-for-word quotations after 20 years, but where I say that I'm quoting, I'm giving the general drift of what was said close to word for word, perhaps not precisely so. But anyhow, I remember of wondering, how can you be so confident that the criminal element is going to stay where you want it to stay? But he went on to say there would be increased security would be needed in the better areas. That would mean more police, better coordinated police efforts. He did not say so, but I wondered at that time about the moves that were afoot to consolidate all the police departments of suburbs around major cities. I think the John Birch Society was one who was saying, support your local police, don't let them be consolidated. And I remember wondering if that was one of the things he had in mind about security. It was not explicitly stated. But anyhow, he went on to say there would be a whole new industry of residential security systems to develop, with alarms and locks and alarms going into the police department so that people could protect their wealth and their well-being. Because some of the criminal activity would spill out of the slums into better, more affluent-looking areas that looked like they'd be worth burglarizing. But, and again, it was stated like as a redeeming quality. See, we're generating all this more crime, but look how good we are. We're also generating the means for you to protect yourself against the crime. Sort of repeated thing throughout this presentation was the recognized evil, and then the self-forgiveness, saying, well, see, we've given you a way out. American industry came under discussion. It was the first that I'd heard of the term global interdependence, or that notion. The stated plan was that different parts of the world would be assigned different roles of industry and commerce in a unified global system. The continued preeminence of the United States and the relative independence and self-sufficiency of the United States would have to be changed. This was one of the several times where he said, in order to create a new structure, you first have to tear down the old. And American industry was one example of that. Our system would have to be curtailed in order to give other countries a chance to build their industries, because otherwise they would not be able to compete against the United States. And this was especially true of our heavy industries that would be cut back while the same industries were being developed in other countries, notably Japan. And at this point there was some discussion of steel, and particularly automobiles. I remember saying that automobiles would be imported from Japan on a equal footing with our own domestically produced automobiles, but the Japanese product would be better. Things would be made so they would break and fall apart. That is in the United States. So that people would tend to prefer the imported variety, and this would give a bit of a boost to foreign competitors. One example was Japanese. In 1969, Japanese automobiles, if they were sold here at all, I don't remember, but they certainly weren't very popular. But the idea was you would get a little bit disgusted with your Ford, GM, or Chrysler product or whatever, because little things like window handles would fall off more, and plastic parts would break that, had they been made of metal, would hold up. Your patriotism about buying American would soon give way to practicality, that if you bought Japanese or German or imported, that it would last longer and you'd be better off. Patriotism would go down the drain then. There was mention elsewhere of things being made to fall apart too. One of the, I don't remember specific items that, if they were even stated, other than automobiles, but I do recall having the impression, sort of in my imagination, of a surgeon having something fall apart in his hands in the operating room at a critical time. Was he including this sort of thing in his discussion? But somewhere in this discussion about things being made deliberately defective and unreliable, not only was to tear down patriotism, but to be just a little source of irritation to people who would use such things. Again, the idea that you not feel terribly secure, promoting the notion that the world isn't a terribly reliable place. The United States was to be kept strong in information, communications, high technology, education, and agriculture. The United States was seen as continuing to be sort of the keystone of this global system, but heavy industry would be transported out. One of the comments made about heavy industry was we had had enough environmental damage from smokestacks and industrial waste, and some of the other people could put up with that for a while. This again was supposed to be a redeeming quality for Americans to accept. You took away our industry, but you saved our environment. So we really didn't lose anything. And along this line, there were talks, there was then discussion about people losing their jobs as a result of industry and opportunities for retraining, and particularly population shifts would be brought about. This is sort of an aside, but I think I'll explore the aside before I forget it more. Population shifts were to be brought about so that people would be tending to move into the Sun Belt. There would be sort of people without roots in their new locations, and traditions are easier to change in a place where there are a lot of transplanted people as compared to trying to change traditions in a place where people grew up and had an extended family where they had roots. Things like new medical care systems, if you pick up from Northeast Industrial City and you transplant yourself to the South, Sun Belt, or Southwest, you'll be more accepting of whatever kind of, for example, controlled medical care you find there than you would accept a change in the medical care system where you had roots and the support of your family. Also in this vein, it was mentioned that he used the plural personal pronoun we. We take control first of the port cities, New York, San Francisco, Seattle. The idea being that this is a piece of strategy, the idea being that if you control the port cities with your philosophy and your way of life, the heartland in between has to yield. I can't elaborate more on that, but it is interesting that if you look around the most liberal areas in the country, and progressively so are the seacoast cities, the heartland, the Midwest, does seem to have maintained its conservatism. But as you take away industry and jobs and relocate people, then this is a strategy to break down conservatism. When you take away industry and people are unemployed and poor, they will accept whatever change seems to offer them survival, and their morals and their commitment to things will all give way to survival. That's not my philosophy, that's the speaker's philosophy. Anyhow, going back to industry, some heavy industry would remain just enough to maintain sort of a seed bed of industrial skills, which could be expanded if the plan didn't work out as it was intended, so that the country would not be devoid of assets and skills. But this was just sort of a contingency plan. It was hoped and expected that the worldwide specialization would be carried on. But perhaps repeating myself, but one of the upshots of all of this is that with this global interdependence, then national identities would tend to be de-emphasized. Each area dependent on every other area for one or another elements in its life. We would all become citizens of the world rather than citizens of any one country. And along these lines, then we can talk about sports. Sports in the United States was to be changed in part as a way of de-emphasizing nationalism. Soccer, a worldwide sport, was to be emphasized and pushed in the United States. And this was of interest because in this area, the game of soccer was virtually unknown at that time. I had a few friends who attended an elementary school other than the one I attended where they played soccer at their school, and they were a real novelty. This was back in the 50s. So to hear this man speak of soccer in this area was kind of surprising. But anyhow, soccer is seen as an international sport and would be promoted, and the traditional sport of American baseball would be de-emphasized and possibly eliminated. Eliminated because it might be seen as too American. And he discussed how eliminating this, one's first reaction might be, well, you pay the players poorly and they don't want to play for poor pay, so they give up baseball and either go into some other sport or some other activity. But he said that's really not how it works. Actually, the way to break down the baseball would be to make the salaries go very high. And the idea behind this was that as the salaries got ridiculously high, there would be a certain amount of discontent and antagonism as people resented athletes being paid so much, and the athletes would begin more and more to resent among themselves what other players were paid, and would tend to abandon the sport. And these high salaries then also could break the owners and alienate the fans. And then the fans would support soccer, and the baseball fields could be used as soccer fields. Wasn't said definitely this would have to happen, but if the international flavor didn't come around rapidly enough, this could be done. There was some comment along the same lines about football, although I seem to recall he said football would be harder to dismantle because it was so widely in the colleges as well as the professional leagues, and would be harder to tear down. And there was something also about the violence in football that met a psychological need that was perceived, and people have a need for this vicarious violence, and So football, for that reason, might be left around to meet that vicarious need. Same thing true with hockey. Hockey had more of an international flavor and would be emphasized. There was some foreseeable international competition about hockey and particularly soccer. At that time, hockey was international between the United States and Canada. I was kind of surprised because I thought the speaker just never impressed me as being at all a hockey fan, and I am. But and it turns out he was not. He just knew about the game and what it would do to this changing sports program. But in any event, soccer was to be the keystone of athletics because it's already a worldwide sport. It's South America and Europe and parts of Asia and the United States should get on the bandwagon. And all this would foster international competition so that we would all become citizens of the world to a greater extent than citizens of our own narrow nations. There was some discussion about hunting. Not surprisingly, hunting requires guns, and gun control is a big element in these plans. And I don't remember the details much, but the idea is that gun ownership is a privilege and not everybody should have guns, and hunting was an inadequate excuse for owning guns, and everybody should be restricted in gun ownership. The few privileged people who should be allowed to hunt could maybe rent or borrow a gun from official quarters rather than own their own. After all, everybody doesn't have a need for a gun, was the way it was put. Very important with sports was sports for girls. Athletics would be pushed for girls, and this was intended to replace dolls. Baby dolls would still be around, a few of them, but you would not see the number and variety of dolls, and dolls would not be pushed because girls should not be thinking about babies and reproduction. Girls should be out on the athletic field just as the boys are. Girls and boys really need not be all that different. Tea sets were to go the way of dolls, and all these things that traditionally were thought of as feminine would be greatly de-emphasized as girls got into more masculine pursuits. And just one of the things I recall was that the sports pages would be full of the scores of girls' teams just right there, right along with the boys' teams. And that's recently begun to, after 20 years, recently begun to appear in our local papers. The girls' sports scores are right along with the boys' sports scores. So all of this to change the role model of what a young girl should look to be while she's growing up. She should look to be an athlete rather than to look forward to being a mother. Entertainment. Movies would gradually be made more explicit as regards sex and language. After all, sex and rough language are real, and why pretend that they are not? There would be pornographic movies in the theaters, on television, and VCRs were not around at that time, but it indicated that these cassettes would be available, and video cassette players would be available for use in the home, and pornographic movies would be available on these VCRs as well as in the neighborhood theater and on your television. Said something like, people, you'll see people in the movies doing everything you can think of. Went on to say that, and all of this is to bring sex out in the open. That was another comment that was made several times, a term, sex out in the open. Violence would be made more graphic. This was intended to desensitize people to violence. There might need to be a time when people would witness real violence and be a part of it. Later on, it'll become clear where this is headed. So there would be more realistic violence in entertainment, would make it easier for people to adjust. People's attitudes towards death would change, and they would not be so fearful of it, but more accepting of it. And not be so aghast at the sight of dead people or injured people. We don't need to have a genteel population paralyzed by what they might see. People would just learn to say, well, I don't want that to happen to me. This was the first statement suggesting that the plan includes numerous human casualties which the survivors would see. This particular aspect of the presentation came back in my memory very sharply a few years later when a movie about the Lone Ranger came out, and I took my very young son to see it, and early in the movie were some very violent scenes. One, the victim's shot in the forehead, and there was sort of a splat where the bullet entered his forehead and some blood, and I remember regretting that I took my son, and remember of feeling anger toward the doctor who spoke. Not that he made the movie, but he agreed to be part of this movement, and I was repelled by the movie, and it brought back this aspect of his presentation very sharply in my memory. As regards music, he made a rather straightforward statement like, music will get worse. And in 1969, the rock music was getting more and more unpleasant. It was interesting that just his word, the way he expressed it, it would get worse, acknowledging that it was already bad. Lyrics would become more openly sexual. No new sugary romantic music would be publicized like that which had been written before that time. All the old music would be brought back on certain radio stations and records for older people to hear. And older folks would have sort of their own radio stations to hear. And the younger people, their music, as it got worse and worse, would be on their stations, and he seemed to indicate that one group would not hear the other group's music. Older folks would just refuse to hear the junk that was offered to young people, and the young people would accept the junk because it was identified them as their generation and helped them feel distinct from the older generation. I remember at the time of thinking that would not last very long because even young kids wouldn't like the junk. When they got a chance to hear the older music that was prettier, they would gravitate toward it. Unfortunately, I was wrong about that. When the kids get through their teens and into their 20s, some of them improve their taste in music, but unfortunately, he was right. They get used to this junk, and that's all they want. A lot of them can't stand really pretty music. He went on to say the music would carry a message to the young, and nobody would even know the message was there. They'd just think it was loud music. At the time, I didn't understand quite what he meant by that, but in retrospect, I think we know what the messages are in the music for the young. And again, he was right. This aspect was sort of summarized with a notion that entertainment would be a tool to influence young people, won't change the older people. They're already set in their ways. But the changes would be all aimed at the young who are in their formative years, and the older generation would be passing. Not only could you not change them, but they're relatively unimportant anyhow. Once they live out their lives and are gone, the younger generation being formed are the ones that would be important for the future in the 21st century. He also indicated all the old movies would be brought back again, and I remember on hearing that, through my mind ran quickly the memories of a number of old movies that I wondered if they would be included, the ones that I thought I would like to see again. Along with bringing back old music and old movies for older people, there were other privileges that also would be accorded older folks. Free transportation, breaks on purchases, discounts, tax discounts, a number of privileges just because they were older. And this was stated to be sort of a reward for the generation which had grown up through the Depression and had survived the rigors of World War II. They had deserved it and they were going to be rewarded with all these goodies. And the bringing back of the good old music and the good old movies was going to help ease them through their final years in comfort. Then the presentation began to get rather grim, because once that generation passed, and that would be in the late 80s and the early 90s, where we are now, most of that group would be gone. And then gradually things would tighten up, and the tightening up would be accelerated. The old movies and old songs would be withdrawn. The gentler entertainment would be withdrawn. Travel, instead of being easy for old folks, travel then would become very restricted. People would need permission to travel, and they would need a good reason to travel. If you didn't have a good reason for your travel, you would not be allowed to travel. Everyone would need ID. This would at first be an ID card you would carry on your person, and you must show when you're asked for it. It was already planned that later on some sort of device would be developed to be implanted under the skin that would be coded specifically to identify the individual. This would eliminate the possibility of false ID, and also eliminate the possibility of people saying, well, I lost my ID. The difficulty about the skin implanted ID was stated to be getting a material that would stay in or under the skin without causing a foreign body reaction, whereby the body would reject it or cause infection, and that this would have to be material on which information could be recorded and retrieved by some sort of scanner while it was not rejected by the body. Silicone was mentioned. Silicone at that time was thought to be well tolerated. It was used to augment breasts. Women who felt their breasts were too small would get silicone implants. I guess that still goes on. In any event, silicone was seen at that time as the promising material to do both, to be retained in the body without rejection, and to be able to retain information retrievable by electronic means. Food. Food supply would come under tight control. If population growth didn't slow down, food shortages could be created in a hurry, and people would realize the dangers of overpopulation. Ultimately, whether the population slows down or not, though, the food supply is to be brought under centralized control so that people would have enough to be well nourished, but they would not have enough to support any fugitive from the new system. And growing one's own food would be outlawed. This would be done under some sort of pretext. In the beginning, I mentioned there were two purposes for everything. One, the ostensible purpose, and two, the real purpose. And an ostensible purpose here would be that growing your own vegetables was unsafe, it would spread disease or something like that. So the acceptable idea was to protect the consumer, but the real idea is to limit the food supply, and growing your own food would be illegal. And if you persist in illegal activities like growing food, then you're a criminal. There was a mention then of weather, W-E-A-T-H-E-R. This was another really striking statement. He said, we can, or soon will be able to control the weather. He said, I'm not merely referring to dropping iodide crystals into clouds to precipitate rain that's already there, but real control. And weather was seen as a weapon of war, a weapon of influencing public policy. You could make rain or withhold rain in order to influence certain areas and bring them under your control. There were two sides to this that were kind of striking. He said, on the one hand, you can make drought during the growing season so that nothing will grow, and on the other hand, you can make for very heavy rains during the harvest seasons so that the fields are too muddy to bring in the harvest, and indeed one might be able to do both. There was no statement how this would be done. It was stated that it was either already possible or very, very close to being possible. Politics. He said very few people know how government really works. something to the effect that elected officials are influenced in ways that they don't even realize. And they carry out plans that have been made for them, and they think they are making, that they are authors of the plans. But actually they've been, are manipulated in ways that they don't understand. Somewhere in the presentation he made two statements that I want to insert at this time. I don't remember just where they were made, but they're valid as in terms of the general overall view. The one statement: people can carry in their minds and act upon two contradictory ideas at the same time, provided these two contradictory ideas are kept far enough apart. And the other one, the other statement is, you can know pretty well how rational people are going to respond to certain circumstances or to certain information that they encounter. So to determine the response you want, you need only control the kind of data or information that they are presented or the kinds of circumstances they're in. And being rational people, they'll do what you want them to do. They may not fully understand what they're doing or why. Somewhere in this connection then was a statement admitting that some scientific research data could be, and indeed has been, falsified in order to bring about desired results. And here it was said, people don't ask the right questions. Some people are too trusting. Now, this was an interesting statement because the speaker and the audience, all being doctors of medicine and supposedly very objectively, dispassionately scientific, and science being the be-all and end-all, well, to falsify data, scientific research data, in that setting is like blasphemy in the church. You just don't do that. Anyhow, out of all of this was to, on the political scene, was to come the new international governing body, probably to come through the UN and with the World Court, but not necessarily through those structures. It could be brought about in other ways. Acceptance of the UN at that time was seen as not being as wide as had been hoped. Efforts would continue to give the United Nations increasing importance. People would be more and more used to the idea of relinquishing some national sovereignty. Economic interdependence would foster this goal from a peaceful standpoint. Avoidance of war would foster it from the standpoint of worrying about hostilities. It was recognized that doing it peaceably was better than doing it by war. It was stated at this point that war is obsolete. And I thought that was an interesting phrase because obsolete means something that once was seen as useful is no longer useful. But war is obsolete, this being because of the nuclear bombs. War is no longer controllable. Formerly, wars could be controlled, but if nuclear weapons would fall into the wrong hands, there could be an unintended nuclear disaster. It was not stated who the wrong hands are. We were free to infer that maybe this meant terrorists, but in more recent years I'm wondering whether the wrong hands might also include people that we've assumed have had nuclear weapons all along. Maybe they don't have them. Just as it was stated that industry would be preserved in the United States a little bit, just in case the worldwide plans didn't work out, just in case some country or some other powerful person decided to bolt from the pack and go his own way. One wonders whether this might also be true with nuclear weapons. When you hear that he said they might fall into the wrong hands, there was some statement that the possession of nuclear weapons has been tightly controlled, sort of implying that anybody who had nuclear weapons was intended to have them. That would necessarily have included the Soviet Union, if indeed they have them. But I recall at the time of wondering, are you telling us or are you implying that that this country willingly gave nuclear weapons to the Soviets? At that time, that seemed like a terribly unthinkable thing to do, much less to admit. The leaders of the Soviet Union seemed to be so dependent on the West, though one wonders whether there might have been some fear that they would try to assert independence if they indeed had these weapons. So, I don't know. It's something to speculate about, perhaps. Who did he mean when he said if these weapons fall into the wrong hands? Maybe just terrorists. We'll see. Anyhow, the new system would be brought in, if not by peaceful cooperation, everybody willingly yielding national sovereignty, then by bringing the nation to the brink of nuclear war. And everybody would be so fearful as hysteria was created about the possibility of nuclear war that there would be a strong public outcry to negotiate a peace, and people would willingly give up national sovereignty in order to achieve peace, and thereby this would bring in the new international political system. This was stated, and a very impressive thing to hear then. If there were too many people in the right places who resisted this, there might be a need to use one or two, possibly more nuclear weapons. As it was put, this would be possibly needed to convince people that we mean business. And that was followed with a statement that by the time one or two of those went off, then everybody, even the most reluctant, would yield. He said something about this negotiated peace would be very convincing. This kind of in a framework or in a context that the whole thing was rehearsed, but nobody would know it. People hearing about it would be convinced that it was a genuine negotiation between hostile enemies who finally had come to the realization that peace was better than war. In this context, discussing war and war is obsolete, a statement was made that there were some good things about war. One, you're going to die anyway, and people sometimes in war get a chance to display great courage and heroism, and if they die, they've died well, and if they survive, they get recognition. So that in any case, the hardships of war on the soldiers are worth it because that's the reward they get out of their warring. Another justification for war expressed was, if you think of the many millions of casualties in World War I and World War II, well, suppose all those people had not died but continued to live and continued to have babies. There would be millions upon millions, and we would already be overpopulated. So those two great wars served a benign purpose in delaying overpopulation. But now there are technological means for the individual and governments to control overpopulation. So in this regard, war is obsolete. It's no longer needed. And then it's, again, it's obsolete because nuclear weapons could destroy the whole universe. War which once was controllable could get out of control. And so for these two reasons, it's now obsolete. There was a discussion of terrorism. Terrorism would be used widely in Europe and other parts of the world. Terrorism at that time was felt would not be necessary in the United States. It possibly could become necessary if the United States did not move rapidly enough into accepting the system. But at least in the foreseeable future, it was not planned, and very benignly on their part. Maybe terrorism would not be required here, but the implication being that it would be indeed used if it was necessary. Along with this came a little bit of a scolding that Americans have had it too good anyway, and just a little bit of terrorism would help convince Americans that the world indeed is a dangerous place, or can be if we don't relinquish control to the proper authorities. There was discussion of money and banking. One statement was inflation is infinite. You can put an infinite number of zeros after any number and put the decimal points wherever you want. This is an indication that inflation is a tool of controllers. Money would become predominantly credit. It was already money is primarily a credit thing, but exchange of money would be not cash or palpable things, but electronic credit signals. People would carry money only in very small amounts for things like chewing gum and candy bars, just pocket sorts of things. Any purchase of any significant amount would be done electronically. Earnings would be electronically entered into your account. There would be a single banking system. It may have the appearance of being more than one, but ultimately, basically, it would be one single banking system, so that when you got paid, your pay would be entered for you into your account balance, and then when you purchased anything at the point of purchase, it would be deducted from your account balance, and you would actually carry nothing with you. Also, computer records can be kept of whatever it was you purchased, so that if you were purchasing too much of any particular item, some official wanted to know what you were doing with your money, they could go back and review your purchases and determine what it was you were buying. There was a statement to the effect that any purchase of significant size, like an automobile, a bicycle, a refrigerator, a radio, or television, or whatever, might be have some sort of identification on it where it could be traced, so that very quickly anything which was either given away or stolen, whatever, authorities would be able to establish who purchased it and when. Computers would allow this to happen. The ability to save would be greatly curtailed. People would just not be able to save any considerable degree of wealth. There was some statement of recognition that wealth represents power, and wealth in the hands of a lot of people is not good for the people in charge, so that if you save too much, you might be taxed. The more you save, the higher the rate of tax on your savings, so your savings really could never get very far. And also, if you began to show a pattern of saving too much, you might have your pay cut. People would say, well, you're saving instead of spending, you really don't need all that money. But basically the idea being to prevent people from accumulating any wealth which might have long-range disruptive influence on the system. People would be encouraged to use credit to borrow, and then also be encouraged to renege on their debts, so that they would destroy their own credit. And the idea here is that, again, if you're too stupid to handle credit wisely, this gives the authorities the chance to come down hard on you once you've overshot your credit. Electronic payments initially would all be based on different kinds of credit cards. These were already in use in 1969 to some extent, not as much as now. But people would have credit cards with the electronic strip on it, and once they got used to that, then it would be pointed out the advantage of having all of this combined into a single credit card serving a single monetary system, and then you don't have to carry around all that plastic. So the next step would be the single card, and then the next step would be to replace the single card with a skin implant. The single card could be lost or stolen, give rise to problems, could be exchanged with somebody else to confuse identity, The skin implant, on the other hand, would be not losable or counterfeitable or transferable to another person, so you and your accounts would be identified without any possibility of error. And the skin implant, of course, would have to be put somewhere that was convenient to the scanner, for example, your right hand or your forehead. At that time when I heard this, I was unfamiliar with the statements in the book of Revelation. The speaker went on to say, now some of you people who read the Bible will attach significance to this, to the Bible, but he went on to disclaim any biblical significance at all. This is just common sense of how the system could work and should work, and there's no need to read any superstitious biblical principles into it. As I say, at the time I was not very familiar with the words of Revelation. Shortly after that I became familiar with them, and the significance of what he said really was striking. I'll never forget it. There was some mention also of implants that would lend themselves to surveillance by providing radio signals. This could be under the skin, or a dental implant put in like a filling, so that either fugitives or possibly every citizen could be identified by a certain frequency from his personal transmitter and could be located at any time or in any place by any authority who wanted to find him. This would be particularly useful if somebody broke out of prison. There was more discussion of personal surveillance. One thing was said, you'll be watching television and somebody will be watching you at the same time at a central monitoring station. Television sets would have a device to enable this. The TV set would not have to be on in order for this to be operative. Also, the television set can be used to monitor what you are watching. People can tell what you're watching on the TV and how you're reacting to what you're watching. You would not know that you were being watched while you were watching your television. How would we get people to accept these things into their homes? Well, people would buy them when they buy their own television. They won't know that they're on there at first. This was described as being by what we now know as cable TV to replace antenna TV. When you buy a TV set, this monitor would just be a part of the set, and most people would not have enough knowledge of electronics to know it's there in the beginning. And then the cable would be the means of carrying the surveillance message to the monitor. By the time people found out that this monitoring was going on, they would also be already very dependent upon television for a number of things. Just the way people are dependent on the telephone today. One thing the television would be used for would be purchases. You wouldn't have to leave your home to purchase. You just turn on your TV and there would be a way of interacting with the television channel to the store that you wanted to purchase, and you could flip the switch from place to place to choose a refrigerator or clothing. This would be both convenient, but it also would make you dependent on the television, so that the built-in monitor is something you could not do without. There was some discussion of audio monitors too, just in case the authorities wanted to hear what was going on in rooms other than where the television monitor was. And in regard to this, statement was made, any wire going into your house, for example, your telephone wire, could be used this way. I remember this in particular because it was fairly near the end of the presentation, and as we were leaving the meeting place, I said something to one of my colleagues about going home and pulling all the wires out of the house, except that I knew I couldn't get by without the telephone. And the colleague I spoke to just seemed numb. To this day, I don't think he even remembers what we talked about or what we heard that time, because I've asked him. But at that time, he seemed stunned. Before all these changes would take place with electronic monitoring, it was mentioned that there would be service trucks all over the place working on the wires and putting in new cables. This is how people who were on the inside would know how things were progressing. Privately owned housing would become a thing of the past. Cost of housing and financing housing would gradually be made so high that most people couldn't afford it. People who already owned their houses would be allowed to keep them, but as years go by, it would be more and more difficult for young people to buy a house. Young people would more and more become renters, particularly in apartments or condominiums. More and more unsold houses would stand vacant. People just couldn't buy them. But the cost of housing would not come down. You'd right away think, well, the vacant house, the price will come down, people will buy it, but there was some statement that to the effect that the price would be held high, even though there was many of them available, so that free marketplaces would not operate. People would not be able to buy these, and gradually more and more of the population would be forced into small apartments which would not accommodate very many children. Then as the number of real homeowners diminished, they would become a minority. There would be no sympathy for them from the majority who dwelled in apartments, and then these homes could be taken by increased taxes or other regulations that would be detrimental to home ownership and would be acceptable to the majority. Ultimately, people would be assigned where they would live, and it would be common to have non-family members living with you. This by way of your not knowing just how far you could trust anybody. This would all be under the control of a central housing authority. Have this in mind in 1990 when the census comes out and they ask how many bedrooms in your house, how many bathrooms in your house, do you have a finished game room? This information really is personal and of no national interest to government under our existing Constitution, but you'll be asked those questions and decide how you want to respond to them. When the new system takes over, people will be expected to sign allegiance to it, indicating they don't have any reservations or holding back to the old system. There just won't be any room, he said, for people who won't go along. We can't have such people cluttering up the place, so such people would be taken to special places. And here I don't remember the exact words, but the inference I drew was that at these special places where they were taken, then they would not live very long. He may have said something like disposed of humanely, but I don't remember very precisely, just the impression that the system was not going to support them when they would not go along with the system. That would leave death as the only alternative. Somewhere in this vein, he said there would not be any martyrs. When I first heard that, I thought he meant that people would not be killed, but as the presentation developed, what he meant was they would not be killed in such a way or disposed of in such a way that they could serve as inspiration to other people, the way martyrs do. Rather, he said something like this, people will just disappear. Just a few additional items sort of thrown in here at the end, which I failed to include where they belong more appropriately. One, the bringing in of the new system, he said, probably would occur on a weekend in the winter. Everything would shut down on Friday evening, and Monday morning when everybody wakened, there would be an announcement made that the new system was in place. During the process of getting the United States ready for these changes, he commented everybody would be busier with less leisure time and less opportunity for people to really look about and see what was going on around them. Also, there would be more changes, more difficult to keep up as far as one's investments. Investment instruments would be changing, policies, interest rates changing, so that it would be a difficult job just to keep up with what you had already earned. Interesting about automobiles, it would look as though there were many, many varieties of automobiles, but when you look very closely, there would be great duplication. It would be made to look different with chrome and wheel covers and this sort of thing, but looking closely, one would see that the same automobile was made by more than one manufacturer. This recently was brought home to me when I was in a parking lot and saw a small Ford, I forget the model, and a small Japanese automobile, which were identical, except for little things like the number of holes in the wheel cover and the chrome around the plate and the shape of the grille. But if you looked at the basic parts of the automobiles, they were identical. They just happened to be parked side by side where I was struck with this, and I was again reminded of what had been said many years ago. I'm hurrying here because I'm near the end of the tape, and let me just summarize by saying to hear all of these things said by one individual at one time in one place, relating to so many different human endeavors, and then to look and see how many of these actually came about, that is, changes accomplished between then and now, and the things which are planned for the future. I think there's no denying that this is controlled, and there is indeed a conspiracy. The question then becomes what to do, and I think first off we must put our faith in God and pray and ask for His guidance, and secondly I think do what we can to inform other individuals as much as possible, as much as they may be interested. Some people just don't care because they're preoccupied with getting along in their own personal endeavors. But as much as possible, I think we should try to inform other people who may be interested, and again, put our faith and trust in God and pray constantly for His guidance and for the courage to accept what we may be facing in the near future, rather than accept peace and justice, which we hear so much now. It's a cliche. Let's insist on liberty and justice for all.